This is Radio VR. I'm Kel Southerington in Washington, D.C. Joining us on the phone from Bangkok, Thailand is Andre Vltchek. He is a novelist, filmmaker, and investigative journalist who has just driven across Ukraine. He drove first from Kiev to Odessa and then to the border of Transnistria and then to the city of Kharkov. I've asked Andre on the radio to talk with us about the current political unrest in Ukraine. Welcome to Radio VR, Andre.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to hear about this road trip. Who did you go with?
I went actually with my translator, who is actually my Russian translator, but he's Ukrainian, and he works for the big progressive website called liva.com. And I also had a driver. And these were people from Borodba, which is a left-wing movement based in Kiev, but they had to abandon Kiev. They had to go to Kharkov because in Kiev it was apparently too dangerous for them.
Now, was your family worried about you?
Well, look, I'm war correspondent. I cover many conflicts, and especially now I'm very active because I'm trying to define how the West is manufacturing the opposition movements or so-called opposition movements and basically trying to take full control over the world. So I work on Turkish-Syrian border. I work in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Thailand, and in Ukraine, in Zimbabwe. So basically, everybody's used to it,
Yeah,
I
but
think.
do you have a wife, children, parents? They must have been very concerned about you during this trip.
Well, yes, of course. But as I said, they're used to it. And actually, Ukraine is not such a dangerous place if you look European and if you have Western passport. It's much more dangerous if you are in the opposition. And that's exactly what many people are facing. Great danger and intimidation. There are some assassinations. I think it's very dangerous for them, not so much for me.
So tell me how it worked. Did you just fly into someplace like Kiev, rent a car, and start driving around?
I flew to Kiev, and I had friends who lended me the car and driver and translator. Well, I didn't need a translator, but he's my friend, so he was actually driving with me. I speak Russian, so that wouldn't be a problem. But they gave me the car, I paid for gas and for the expenses, and this 2,000 kilometers was actually extremely revealing. We drove from Kiev, as you said, to Odessa, to Transnistria border, then back to Odessa, and then we were stopping in small villages, actually talking to people, including babushkas, the grandmothers, in the fields, in the abandoned villages in Ukraine, because Ukraine is it's a really devastated country. After so-called independence from Soviet Union, there is a lot of misery in the countryside, in the cities. We stopped in Krivoy Rog, or Krivoy Rig, as they call it in Ukraine. This is a major steel industry town. Again, great frustration of the people there. Unpaid salaries or salaries paid only partially. Kharkov, which is called second capital of Ukraine, because it was actually their first capital, but it's the second largest city. It's a student town where people are absolutely openly pro-Russian and extremely frustrated with the way things in Kiev are going. And I went to the border with Russia, which again, the reason I went is because there was all this uproar in the Western press saying that Russian tanks and Russian troops are sitting right at the border. I came there, I didn't see any tanks. I saw only Ukrainian tanks.
So let me jump in here and ask you this, Andre. CNN is reporting today that Russia says Ukraine is on the brink of civil war. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do, but for different reasons than CNN. It may be on the brink of civil war because actually people, especially Russian-speaking Ukrainians and progressive or left-wing Ukrainians, which I believe is probably the majority, are pushed to the corner. They feel that their democracy was kidnapped by the West, that they were forced into, that there was a coup in Kiev, that they were forced into the government, into the system they don't want. And for that reason, yes, there may be a civil war, but definitely not because of some Russian involvement.
All right.
Or anything.
So you wrote an article that was just published about 2 days ago by a site called Counterpunch. And in the article, you write, Ukraine is burning. It is going to the dogs. It has been taken over by an illegitimate government. engorged with fascists, neo-Nazis, and simple pro-Western opportunists, as well as countless EU and US-sponsored members of various NGOs. Those are strong words. Why are you so convinced that the Western powers were involved?
Actually, the West is involved in several projects of that nature, from Syria to Venezuela, Cuba. It is basically antagonizing and trying to wipe out any dissent that stands on their way to their global dream of global domination. So I think Ukraine was just one way to support the so-called revolution, or Maidan revolution as they call it. Maidan is the main square in Kiev. Was the way to antagonize Russia because, as we know, Soviet Union, after it disintegrated, Russia was fooled. It had been promised that NATO is not going to expand to the east. It was told that actually it's going to be integrated to Western structures to some extent, that it's not going to face any military threat. It was all a lie. And actually the whole doctrine of Zbigniew Brzezinski, former security advisor, was to antagonize and destroy first the Soviet Union. And
let me jump in here. Let me jump in here because I have a question. All right, this may be absolutely how it happened, but why would the West have wanted to destabilize Ukraine? I mean, let's look at the situation. Ukraine had a very friendly government, friendly toward the West government, and Russia was helping to support it financially. So why would the West have wanted to step in the way and upset Russia, which would cut off aid to Ukraine?
Well, it's very simple. European Union approached the government in Kiev and they offered them an agreement which would be totally insane to accept. Basically, the agreement would consist of the Western companies being allowed to invest and take over the companies in central, south, and eastern part of Ukraine. You know that there is a great coal mining, there is a steel industry. It's a very powerful, heavy industry, one of the largest in the world. And so the idea was the companies would be able to operate there, but the people of Ukraine would get almost nothing in return. They would not be allowed to even travel to European Union. They would definitely not be allowed to work in European Union. So the government rejected the idea, not because it was pro-Russian or because it was left-wing. It was simply, it was doing the right thing under the circumstances. And of course, the West is not used to something like that. And, there were billions of dollars literally flying in lost profits, which I say sarcastically lost profits and so they began this stabilization process, which is very similar to that in Venezuela and Syria and everywhere. Basically, you support the opposition, you create the opposition, you support the opposition, you finance the NGOs that are antagonistic to the government.
But in your article, you zero in on this point. You say the United States and the European Union wanted to destabilize Ukraine to gain access to the region's cheap labor force and abundant natural resources. My question for you is, which industries were of most interest to the United States and the European Union countries? And what are the natural resources that they wanted to have?
Two very important: coal and iron ore, or processing of it through the steel mills. So some of the biggest steel mills are in eastern and central and Ukraine. Mining is done around Donetsk. Kryvyi Rog is one of the largest.
So mining was one.
Steel producers, and mining of coal and iron ore. And then steel industry, as I said, in Kryvyi Rog and elsewhere. Also, don't forget that Ukraine has a very educated workforce.
Yeah, I know that.
Very educated. The prices of I talked to workers in Kryvyi Rog. They are the biggest steel company, which is owned by Indian Metal company, is actually the workers there are making between $180 and $500 a month. That's 3 to 4 times lesser than they're making in Chelyabinsk across the border in Russia.
But but let me jump in here, because steel production in the United States, and I'm sure in Europe, is beyond what those economies can absorb. And it has been for a very long time, unless you're talking about specialty steel products. And as far as cheap labor goes, yes, it's true that they might want to access that, but there are plenty of other places to get to cheap labor, China for one. So why would this situation be of greater interest to these two regions, the United States and the European Union, than other places?
Well, you have to understand that when I say cheap labor, I mean, we are talking about the minimum wage in Ukraine, which is $100 a month. That's below even a country like Indonesia, at least official. Of course, most of people in Indonesia are underemployed. They don't make official wages, but still, at least on the paper, it's just unbelievably low. It's incomparable now to even China. And you have this country with very educated labor force sitting right next to the European Union, plus the mining industry, iron ore and coal, which we already mentioned. And so that's one reason. The other reason is that through absorbing, so-called absorbing Ukraine in in the West, there was danger for Russia that the military bases and NATO would eventually move all the way to Russian border, and that was also one of the designs.
But let me go back to this point about steel and coal, because there's so much of that being produced right now in the United States that they certainly don't need any more of it. If the Obama administration wanted to do anything, it would probably be to depress production and to bring...
Yes, but you understand it was much more European action. I mean, when we talk about the United States, we are talking about destabilization of Ukraine. So the NATO and the military force could expand towards Western military force could expand towards the Russian borders. I think economically, it was much more European interest than the U.S.
It was more militarily for the United States, and the European Union wanted it for its workers and natural resources. Am I correct in that?
Yes, and that's why the European Union agreement was used as a main, pressing point on the Ukrainian government.
All right. So right now, you say there are a lot of abandoned villages and ones that have been destroyed, and you saw these as you were driving all over Ukraine just a few days ago. Why have these villages been abandoned, and why are they destroyed?
Well, first of all, there is a demographic tragedy that took place right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The life expectancy of Ukrainian people, population of Ukraine declined from 51 million to 44 million now. It was 51 million in 1991, I believe, and now it's 44 million. Only. So basically, villages were also, first of all, there was a decline in population. Then agriculture production as well as industrial production was declining dramatically. So I talked to people in the villages between Nikolaev and Kryvyi Rog, and I was told that basically government stopped providing basic services to the villagers like gas or running water. One lady was telling me that she's drinking water from the well, and I saw the water from the well, and it was actually contaminated. It was brown from fertilizer.
That's terrible. But is it possible that some of these towns were what we once used to call in the United States company towns, and that they are simply no longer needed because the dynamics of the Ukrainian economy have changed now that you don't have a state-run economy? So there's no place in the new Ukraine for them now that the Soviet Union is not running their economy. Is that possibly the reason these places have just collapsed and gone away?
Well, that could be true if Ukraine would be still able to sustain itself in terms of food. It's not. It's importing food. Food prices are inaccessible for most of the people. It's importing food from the West mostly. It doesn't produce what it used to produce. And so it's basically a typical African scenario that you see in Senegal where the local agriculture is bleeding out, it collapses, and then big European food chains come in and they start offering in the supermarkets food that nobody can afford.
Yeah, actually, I've been to Senegal.
Yeah.
I visited Senegal.
So you know what I'm talking about.
But in your article, you blame the market economy for these troubles. Why do you blame the market economy?
Well, it is a market economy, isn't it? I mean, basically, you had a structure which was quite satisfactory for the majority of people. And in the countryside, they are still speaking very nostalgically about the Soviet Union and about the system that the Soviet Union was offering. I'm going to publish in a few days a big article, actually in Counterpunch and in RT, where I'm going into the details, speaking about exactly this. So the majority of people in Ukraine that I spoke to feel very nostalgic about the Soviet centralized system. In the countryside, definitely the majority is overwhelming. I would say like 90%. And then the marketing system comes, basically uses this typical supermarket approach, that offering first cheap prices, then bleeding out the agriculture, and exactly what you saw in Senegal. And then when everything collapses, it raises the price of 1 liter of yogurt to like $5 that nobody can afford in a country where the income in Senegal may be $60 or in Ukraine maybe 200 or 150 on average. So this is exactly what happened there. It's a market. It's a market system to which Ukraine was not used to, that most of people don't know how to operate in, and most of people actually don't want to.
Thank you for coming on the radio so much. And I know you're a prolific writer, and you actually have a new book coming out or going to press again. You've written several books that have been very, very successful. So it's great to have you on the radio with us.
Thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you.
All right, thanks. That was Andre Vltchek, a novelist and filmmaker and investigative journalist who has just driven all around Ukraine, talking about the situation politically there. In Washington, I'm Kels Hetherington for Radio VR.